A new name has entered the Orioles search process for a manager. It's the future Hall of Famer Albert Pujols. We'll talk about how realistic that is coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, October 20th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to talk about the report that came out from last week that the Orioles are potentially interested in interviewing Albert Pujols for their managerial opening. We'll talk about what his background in baseball and coaching is, the other teams that are interested in him, and why, he may not be the O's manager, but why at least it's nice that they are looking a little bit outside the box. Then we'll chat about Brandon Hyde, what his next job might be, and finally some other outside the box candidates the Orioles could take a look at. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So at this point in the process of the 9 managerial openings around Major League Baseball, only one of them has been filled. That is the Texas Rangers. Bruce Bochy out. Skip Schumacher is in, though Schumacher was already working in the Rangers front office, so a pretty easy quote-unquote hire to make. The other 8 who are presumably looking outside the organization, although the Orioles still could theoretically give Tony Mansolino the full-time job. The other 8 teams that are looking outside the organization, they are still looking. And if you kind of go back to 2024 and you see where the manager hirings happened, usually last week of October, first week in November, right around the World Series and the World Series ending is generally when these hires happened. So it's not like the O's are behind anybody. Again, there's 7 other teams in the same spot who have not made a hire yet. And some of that might be because a lot of teams are hiring the same candidates. And one candidate who seems to be already have interviewed with multiple teams now, potentially, is the future Hall of Famer, Albert Pujols. As it was reported on Wednesday night of last week, Alden Gonzalez and Jeff Passan of ESPN reporting that the Orioles are expected to interview Albert Pujols for the manager job. Now, at this point, recording here Sunday afternoon, it's not clear if that interview with Albert has actually happened yet with the Orioles, but that's certainly a different name. Now, all we know to this point is that the Orioles are considering Tony Mansolino to keep the job and that they have interviewed former Mets manager and current Yankees third base coach Luis Rojas for the job. Rojas is the only one we definitely know that they interviewed. And it had been previously reported that the Angels were actually closing in on Albert Pujols as their choice to be their next manager. But now Sam Blum over at The Athletic is reporting that the Angels are strongly considering other options. Now, Sam Blum and Jeff Passan both reported that Pujols is still the most likely candidate to be the Angels manager and not so much for the Orioles. He played for them. He's on this 10-year, $10 million contract with the Angels right now to be like a special assistant to the front office and an ambassador for the team and like an instructor at spring training and other things. So I guess makes it a little bit easier for them to hire him as their manager. But I think most people expected, okay, Pujols' name first came up with the Angels, and it wasn't terribly shocking, at least. We knew he wanted to get into managing at the big league level. The more surprising is that another team outside of Anaheim would be interviewing him. I think the thought was either Pujols would get the Angels job or he'd be waiting at least another year to get a big league managerial job. Maybe not so fast. The Orioles at least have some interest here. Now, for Pujols, he does have a little bit of coaching experience. He managed Escogido in Lidom last winter. That is the Dominican Winter League, probably the best known and highest level winter league in the Caribbean. And he did lead them to their first Lidom title since the 2015-16 season when Escogido won it all last winter. They also went on to win the 2025 Caribbean Series, which is kind of like the Champions League in soccer, but for the best Caribbean winter ball teams from some of the other countries that do have winter ball leagues as well. And so not only did they win Lidom, but they also won the Caribbean Series under Pujols. And that's very different still from managing in Major League Baseball, but it is some experience. And Pujols, at least at this point, is also set to manage Team Dominican Republic in the 2026 World Baseball Classic that gets started in around February or so of next year. Now, that's a position he would step down from if either the Orioles or the Angels or some other team hire him to be their big league manager. So he, of course, can be in big league spring training in February. But it just shows that he's getting the experience. He's looking for more experience. And I think most people know he wants to be a manager at some point. That's one of the reasons why he is interviewing for these jobs. Now, he does have a connection to the Orioles through Mike Elias, because Elias's first job out of college was working in scouting with the Cardinals from 2007 to 2011 until he took the job with the Astros. And that was the tail end of Pujols' time as a player for the Cardinals. That 2011 season was his final one in St. Louis. And Pujols is still close with Matt Holliday, who they played together with the Cardinals. Of course, Matt is the father of Jackson Holliday, currently the Orioles leadoff hitter and second baseman. The two of them are still pretty close after playing together. So Pujols does have some connections to Baltimore. And I think most people listening to this know his MLB credentials. If not, he's going to be a Hall of Famer. 22 big league seasons from 2001 to 2022, 12 years with the Cardinals, 10 with the Angels, then had that resurgent half season with the Dodgers right there at the end. 11-time All-Star. He won 3 MVPs, 2005, 2008, and 2009 in St. Louis. Also won Rookie of the Year with the Cardinals, won 2 World Series titles with the Cards. Simply put, Pujols is one of the probably 10 greatest hitters of all time, you could argue, in Major League Baseball. And when he's eligible here a couple of years from now, I guess it'll be 2027, he'll be eligible. He's a slam dunk Hall of Famer. I will say that while I don't think Pujols will be the Orioles manager, even though the O's are going to interview him, I still think he's either going to get the Angels job or he will not be a big league manager this offseason and probably wait until the next cycle next year. I do enjoy that the Orioles are somewhat thinking outside the box with this interview with Albert Pujols. It's kind of similar to the option I gave when I did my first, kind of 7 managerial options for the Orioles episode after the season. And one of my options that I gave out is Carlos Beltran, who was briefly hired as the manager of the Mets a couple of years ago before the trash can banging scandal got out. He was fired before even managing a game in New York. And he has stayed around the game since then. And, a great player in his time who has a connection to Mike Elias as well, but would be a little different. Now, Pujols does not come with the same cheating questions that Carlos Beltran comes from, but as Mike Elias has talked about, managerial experience is good and something they're looking into for the next manager, but it's not always necessary to get the best candidate out there. And if the Orioles feel that Albert Pujols gives a certain level of leadership and experience into that clubhouse that the Orioles clubhouse needs, I'd be totally on board with them making Albert Pujols the full hire for this job. Now, again, overall, if I had to make a prediction, I think Pujols will be the Angels manager next year, and that organization's kind of a disaster, and we'll see how that goes. But I do, at the very least, again, not really thinking that he's going to be the O's manager. I'd say of the 2 guys who've interviewed that we know so far, I think Luis Rojas has a better chance of ending up being the Orioles manager. But I do like it that the Orioles are looking around. They're probably interviewing a ton of different people already, considering different options from different places. And that tells me, hey, Elias and the team are trying to uncover every stone to find the best manager for this team going forward to get them back in contention where they need to be after a very disappointing 2025 season. So, we've talked about a lot of names that could be connected, have been connected with this managerial job. How about some other outside the box ideas? Because Pujols is definitely somewhat outside the box. Let's go even further out of it. How about 3 more candidates coming up next that I haven't mentioned yet, really, in this managerial search that maybe the O's would take a look at to try and, zig while others zag as all these manager jobs are open this offseason. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. There's nothing like catching a baseball game live. The energy, the crowd, the chance to see your team in person, but actually getting tickets, that's the tough part. Queues, login screens, surprise fees, it takes all the fun out of it. So that's why I use Game Time, the app that gives the advantage back to fans. Game Time is fast, it's easy, and it's backed up by the Game Time guarantee. You'll always get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best price. Plus, all fees are included, so the price you see is the price you pay. And the app, it makes it super simple. I can even see the exact view from my seat before buying the tickets. And the fees are included, so you know your total up front. That means no surprise fees at checkout. So download the Game Time app, Create an account and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. So as the Orioles are reportedly going to interview Albert Pujols for their managerial opening, that's somewhat of an outside-of-the-box thought in a potential hire. Other teams are looking at him, so not maybe fully outside the box, but how about three more names that are outside the box? Because we have a potential hire coming up around baseball that was definitely some different thinking. As Ken Rosenthal and others at The Athletic reported on Saturday that the San Francisco Giants were close to hiring Tennessee baseball head coach Tony Vitello to be their new manager. Now, Jeff Passan of ESPN did report later on Saturday that the deal wasn't done yet, and it would be in the next 48 to 72 hours that an official decision on both the Giants and Vitello's side would be made. But Tony Vitello, I mean, that's a guy who came in, he's been at Tennessee for the past 7 years. They've won a national championship. They've been one of the best programs in baseball. He's a fiery guy. But even with all of his success at UT, I mean, it's definitely a risk. A guy who's never coached or managed or played anywhere near the big league level in professional baseball, it's a different animal. But I respect the Giants for going that direction. Again, as of recording here Sunday afternoon, nothing is official that he's getting that Giants job. But I love that San Francisco thought about it, that Vitello's interested in it. Like, that is an intriguing outside-the-box hire. So who are some other candidates like Vitello, like Albert Pujols, that the Orioles could target? I came up with three of them, all three from a different category. Category number one is the Tony Vitello category, the college coach with lots of success category. And that is 47-year-old Clemson baseball head coach Erik Bakich. Now, Bakich does have a local connection. His first head coaching job at the Division I level was at the University of Maryland for 3 years, from 2010 to 2012. He came over to Maryland, his first head coaching job. Never got to see the fruits of his labor because he left for a better job after 3 years. But that program was in dismay. It hadn't been to the NCAA tournament since the early 1970s. He didn't get them there in those 3 years, but he made them so much better. And he built the groundwork for the next coach, John Sheff, to come in and take that Maryland team to back-to-back super regionals in 2014 and 2015 and put them onto the map in college baseball. He had, Bakich had the best recruiting classes basically Maryland had ever had in baseball and turned that program around. And he turned that into a job at Michigan. Again, not a perennial baseball power, but he built that program up into the best one in the Big Ten and made it to the College World Series finals. Didn't win it all, but made it to the finals in 2019. An incredible feat for a Big Ten team, especially in a cold weather state in Michigan. Then he got eventually the Clemson job. He's been there for the past 3 years and has made Clemson, which was already a solid program, into one of the best teams in the country. Now, Clemson has not, had the big College World Series run under him yet, but it's something Bakich has done. Pretty fiery guy, but, people seem to like him in his dugouts. I think maybe the skills could translate into an MLB clubhouse. You'd, again, need to surround him with veteran coaches, I think, on his staff. But maybe that's an outside-the-box job that they could do. Second guy is more in the Pujols category. This is MLB legend who didn't retire that long ago and is now interested in coaching. And that is Pujols' former teammate, 43-year-old former big league catcher Yadier Molina, who was the Cardinals catcher for a long, long time, 2004 to 2022 as their catcher, all with St. Louis, a 10-time All-Star and a 2-time World Series champion. Of course, was there in St. Louis when Mike Elias worked there as well from 2007 to 2011. And just like Pujols, has a little bit of managerial experience. Molina was the manager of Team Puerto Rico at the 2023 World Baseball Classic and is set to do that same job for Puerto Rico in next year's WBC in 2026. And Molina was very public this week saying he wants to get into coaching in the major leagues, is open to not beginning with managing. He's apparently been in talks with the Cardinals for some sort of coaching job on their major league staff, but eventually does want to be a big league manager. He's got those connections. He's a catcher. He's had a lot of success. He's, again, why not? Take at least a little look into it. Final name there is the one that would, I think, be the closest to the box itself of these three, would be the one that makes the most sense, the one guy with actual managerial experience. But that is 61-year-old former manager and current ESPN and Yes Network analyst Joe Girardi, who has managed for 3 different ball clubs in his career. 1 year with the Marlins in 2006, 10 years with the Yankees, 2008 to 2017, and 3 years with the Phillies from 2020 to 2022 was his last managerial job. Now, only time he had a losing record in a full big league season was that 1 year with the Marlins in 2006. But even that year, he turned around a bad team, won 78 games, and was named National League Manager of the Year after he had already been fired by the Marlins. Now, he caught on with the Yankees 2 years later and immediately had success. In his second year with the Yankees, they won the 2009 World Series under Girardi's leadership. He continued to take the Yankees back to the postseason, but never was able to kind of get over the hump and eventually lost his job after 2017's loss, and Aaron Boone came in to take the job. Now, he was hired by the Phillies to try and get them out of the rebuild. Didn't go so well. Girardi was fired in the middle of the 2022 season by the Phillies. Rob Thompson took over, led the team to the World Series that year. And of course, Thompson has been Phillies manager since then. Now, he was a big league catcher for 15 years, throughout most of the 90s and others. Won 3 World Series. He was an all-star 1 year and actually does have a connection to the Orioles. Now, this has almost been 20 years ago, but in 2007, when the Orioles fired Sam Perlazzo as their manager, they actually interviewed Joe Girardi and offered him the job. This was after Girardi had been fired by the Marlins. It was about, 6 months before he took the Yankees job, and he was kind of back working in TV at that point. He interviewed, the Orioles offered him the job, but he turned it down. Did not take the Orioles job, waited out for a better job, and he got it in that offseason, getting the Yankee job. I wonder what history would have been like differently if the O's had Girardi, a couple years before they eventually hired Buck Showalter. But speaking of Buck Showalter, the last time the Orioles hired a veteran big league manager straight out of a TV baseball job, which is what they did when they hired Buck. He was on TV in 2010 before he took the Orioles job. It worked out pretty well for this franchise. So I'm not saying Joe Girardi would be Buck Showalter here, but he's a guy who brings the experience, but it's also a little outside the box at this point. He's won a World Series. You certainly love that. I wouldn't be totally against it. Now, Girardi, I think the biggest issue with him probably is that most people around him, it seems like at this point, don't think he's going to take another managerial job. I don't think it's completely out of the question, but we will certainly see if that is a possibility for the Orioles. But just wanted to give 3 more candidates that, hey, especially with the Albert Pujols news, the Tony Vitello news, maybe some others we're not even thinking of could be in the running for this Orioles managerial job. Speaking of Orioles manager, of course, there is an opening because the O's back in May fired Brandon Hyde, who had been here since he was hired in November of 2018, the last time the Orioles went through a process like this. But Hyde is not going to be gone for long. It seems like he's going to have a job in baseball for 2026 and might even be a big league manager. Again, get you those quick updates on our former boss, Brandon Hyde, to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Just pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. And I love how FanDuel gives me so many ways to play. You can build parlays, you can try player props, you can even follow the live lines during these games. And it makes watching football even more exciting when you got a little something riding on the action. So whether you're a casual fan or you just love diving into the stats, FanDuel makes that game day experience so much better, especially when, the Ravens are on a bye, or you just really don't want to watch the Ravens at this point, even when they are playing. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. So to finish out this kind of managerial-centered episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, I want to talk a little bit about Brandon Hyde, who reportedly is in the mix for some other jobs. Now, let's start with the Giants. Now, we know, as I just talked about, seems like they're leaning towards Tennessee head coach Tony Vitello being their next manager, although as Jeff Passan reported on Saturday, not a done deal yet and still could fall apart. Buster Posey and the Giants have also reportedly spoken to Brandon Hyde about the manager job. Of course, the Orioles fired Hyde back in May after he'd been the manager since 2019. Didn't, take another job during the season, but it would be an intriguing spot for Brandon Hyde to take over. Like, if Tony Vitello doesn't end up taking this Giants job, Nick Hundley, another former Orioles catcher, seemed to be the front runner for a while, but reportedly Hundley has pulled his name out of the Giants managerial search, citing some sort of family concerns or situations or whatever. Maybe it doesn't mean he's not ready to manage in 2026 because of that. Hope obviously all the best for him and his family, whatever is going on there. But if it's not Vitello, maybe it would be Brandon Hyde in San Francisco. It'd be an interesting spot for him. They have some veterans more than the Orioles did, but it's still a team on the younger side for the Giants. And it's a team that's trying to get over the hump, right? Really, since that crazy 107-win season back in 2021 under Gabe Kapler, this team's been like a perennial 500 team. I mean, they literally went 81-81 this season. They're looking to get over the hump. That's why they hired a veteran manager in Bob Melvin to come in and get them over the hump. He couldn't do it. They let him go after this season. Maybe Hyde could do it. Now, you could argue Brandon Hyde wasn't able to do that in Baltimore. He did take them to back-to-back playoff appearances. He helped them get better probably sooner than they thought in that 2022 season when they really turned things around. But he also went 0-5 in the postseason, had a disaster start to this year. And you could argue the Orioles definitely got better under Hyde, but never got over the hump they were looking to get to, especially when it comes to postseason success. But again, they brought in Bob Melvin to be that over-the-hump guy, and it didn't work, so maybe they go in a different direction with someone like Brandon Hyde. Now, Sam Blum of The Athletic is also reporting that Brandon Hyde could be in the mix for the Angels job as well, especially if, Pujols doesn't take it or takes the Orioles job or whatever it may be. I do feel like if Hyde does get another managerial job, especially if he gets one this offseason, it'll be with more of a rebuilding team. Now, who knows exactly what the overall plans are for the Angels franchise? Can you really call them in a rebuild or just treading water and being a bad organization? I would say is closer to what the Angels are. But Hyde, especially early on in Baltimore and when the team made the transition to being good, he showed that he can really excel in that rebuilding environment. He was kind of ready for the tough moments early on, from 2019 through 2021, and then was able to turn that clubhouse around when he got a little more talent in there to work with. And I feel like, even the Rockies job, maybe the Minnesota Twins jobs that are open, potentially the Nationals job this offseason could work well for Brandon Hyde. He seemed to be comfortable in that spot. He not only knows how to handle a team that's kind of built to lose, but can also help to transition that team back into winning. He's shown success in both of those things in his time at the helm of the Orioles. And I still think he was a good manager here. I overall think that for Hyde, like, he was scapegoated a bit in Baltimore. Something certainly had to change with how terrible the Orioles were, the 15-28 start. What they chose to change was firing Brandon Hyde in mid-May. Did it work out? I mean, the team played better under Manzolino, but they weren't anywhere close to turning the season around and even sniffing close to the postseason. So I'm not sure it worked out in the complete way they wanted it to. Who knows if he would have kept the job? Would he just have gotten fired this offseason anyway? There's obviously questions there that we won't have the answer to. But I still think he was a good big league manager, and I think he certainly deserves another job if he wants one. It seems like there are multiple teams at least willing to interview him this offseason. Even if he doesn't get another manager role, I have to expect with him interviewing for jobs, he'll probably have a job, maybe someone's bench coach, or, he was a base coach with the Cubs for a while. Maybe he goes back to that for a little bit and kind of rebuilds his managerial value for a couple of years and eventually gets a job. We've seen plenty of candidates do that as well as they kind of cycle through those big league managerial and coaching jobs as well. But whoever the Orioles hire, we'll see. World Series gets started here on Friday. So at some point, mid to late next week, the season could be over, and that'll probably expedite a little bit more these managerial hirings. You want to do them before you do any free agency and trade stuff generally for most teams, especially ones that look to compete in 2026 like the Orioles do. So hopefully we are sooner rather than later at this point of the Orioles hire. And whenever it happens, we'll certainly have the coverage right here on the show. But until that does happen, we continue our Orioles season review series. Next up on tomorrow's episode, Cade Povich. What a weird year. He started a lot. He was the Orioles' third most valuable pitcher in terms of FWAR. He also wasn't very good. He also made his changeup better. His breaking balls were worse. There's a lot to talk about with what went on with Cade Povich. Is there even a spot on this team for him next year is another question. We'll get into all that on tomorrow's episode to recap his season. Until then, Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribing or following the show wherever you listen, Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Leave a 5-star rating and a review. Really, really helps out the pod. And if you have Orioles questions, mailbag questions, you want to talk some ball, you have feedback on the podcast, I certainly appreciate it. You can always email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. That'll do it for today's episode. We'll be back tomorrow to talk Cade Povich. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.